Hello, friends. Michael Morrell here, and I'm so glad you're joining me for this conversation. I want to talk to you today about ancestors, not in some abstract genealogical way, but as living presences, or perhaps I should say as loving presences who might still have something to offer us and to whom we might still have something to offer in return. Now, I know that for many of you, that sentence alone raises a whole host of questions, maybe even alarm bells. Like, is this spiritually safe? And if you come from like a Protestant Christian background like me, there might even be at least a part of you asking, is this biblical? Doesn't this edge dangerously close to forbidden territory, the kind of thing that our scriptures warn against? And yet, there's also something in us that really longs for this kind of connection, isn't there? Something that resonates when we light a candle for a departed loved one's birthday, or sense our grandmother's prayers still holding us, or when we feel the weight of history, both beautiful and terrible, moving through our bodies. I feel like we're living in a time where the past feels unbearably present. We're reckoning with histories of violence and colonization. We're watching our elders die, sometimes alone, as often happened during COVID in particular, and sometimes suddenly. We're inheriting a planet in crisis and wondering what kind of ancestors we will be to future generations. And in the midst of all this upheaval, many of us are discovering or rediscovering that we don't have to navigate these waters alone. There might be wisdom, healing, and even repair available through a renewed relationship with those who have come before us. My guest today is someone who's been walking this path for years and doing it in ways that intersect with multiple wisdom traditions. Dr. Daniel Foor is the author of Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing, and he's the founder of a growing community of practitioners doing what he calls ancestral lineage healing. But here's what makes Daniel's story particularly fascinating, and I'll admit particularly challenging for some of us. He's a practicing Muslim who also holds initiations in Western African Orisha traditions. He's lived in North Africa and now makes his home in Granada, Spain, that ancient crossroads where Islamic mysticism once flourished. And he describes himself as affirming the liberatory, animist, and life-affirming sensibilities at the heart of Islam and Islamic mysticism. Now, if you're like me, a contemplative Christian trying to stay rooted in the way of Jesus while practicing what Barbara Brown Taylor calls holy envy toward other traditions, you might be feeling both intrigued and uneasy right now. How does someone hold these multiple commitments? How does ancestor work fit within a monotheistic framework, or does it? And perhaps most importantly, what can we learn from someone walking this path, even if we're not called to walk it in exactly the same way? That's what I want to explore with Daniel today. Not abandoning our own roots, but deepening them, and not blurring boundaries between traditions for their own sake, but understanding how healing might flow across them, and not bypassing the challenging theological questions, but sitting with them honestly together. So whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, or simply someone longing for deeper connection with your lineage and your land in these turbulent times, I think there's something here for you. Daniel, welcome. So glad that you're here with us today.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be here with you and with everybody listening.
Absolutely. So, for those who might be encountering this idea for the first time, what is ancestral lineage healing? How do you describe the core paradigm of ancestral reverence and healing that you've developed, and what kind of community of practitioners has grown around this work?
Sure. Let me situate myself first just a little. As you mentioned, I live now in Granada area with my wife and our two young girls, and my own ancestors of blood are early German and English settler colonialists in North America. So my lineages have lived for at least 7 generations in any direction in what's now Ohio, Pennsylvania, Turtle Island. And so I wasn't raised with any kind of framework for relating with the ancestors or the other than humans or the unseen. And over time, through studying of different spiritual systems and psychology and doing my own work and crashing around, learning in the best way I could, starting in 2004 or five, I began to guide others in a practice of ancestral lineage healing or repair work. Now, that came out of the period of ritual work, maybe 6 years or so before that, of coming into direct connection with much older ancestors in my own blood lineages. And that was through contact with the shamanic practice, paganism, earth honoring spirituality from my own European roots. And and then seeing some of the psychological implications of that. And so the in those 20 years since, I've supported a lot of others in the work of ancestral healing, and I'll say more about what that means in a moment. But just to give the structural kind of context, the form that that plays out in is through the practice or business organization that I guide called Ancestral Medicine. And we've seen through now 8 cohorts or 8 groups of people that we've trained to guide the work. So it means that lineage healing work is available in over 30 languages, and there's nearly 300 people in the network. And I've written a book called Ancestral Medicine, as you mentioned. And so it's been a specialization in my adult life over the last 20 years to help people with this particular kind of topic of relating with the dead generally, but then engaging in healing practices with blood lineage ancestors more specifically. And the qualities of this particular approach to ancestral engagement, which distinguish it a bit from other things like it out there, is that it is a lineage-oriented approach. So we're not looking at just individuals, but we're looking at bloodlines or groups of ancestors. And it is definitely rooted in ritual, spirituality, respect for the reality of the ancestors. So they're not reduced to just a part of our psychology or just a knowing field or some energetic phenomena. There's a working assumption that they're as real as you and I. They're just not incarnate right now. And there's quite an emphasis on ritual safety and proceeding in a way that recognizes that the dead who are troubled can have a lot of impact here. And the dead who are benevolent, wise, loving can be quite helpful as well. And so when I'm teaching the work, I'm guiding it for a worst case scenario and for someone who's quite open in a way that they're going to be able to engage safely in a way that puts them in direct conscious connection with older lineage blessings and healings. So the maybe last thing, because I don't want to go on too much about the how, is once one has determined a lineage that they want to give attention to in a healing way, the basic methodology looks like connecting with much older ancestors on that lineage, usually ones who lived before cycles of dislocation, forced migration, colonialism, or just diminishing of well-being. So in the case of my own lineages, that's often 1,000, 2,000 years back to the strata of Northwestern European culture that would feel more indigenous. And connecting with those ancestors and asking them to bring the healing energy forward along the lineage to those who are still in need, so that the dead themselves are in a very healed and settled and vibrant state. So we're respecting the hierarchy, if you will, of lineage by asking the older ones to bring healing where it's needed to those who haven't really settled yet into their status as an ancestor. Yeah.
Wow. You've said a lot there. And there's so many different ways that this conversation could go. Like there's part of me that wants to ask, like in our sort of reductive, materialist, scientific world, like how can one confidently assert or experience that the ancestors are as real as you and I? They're simply not incarnate. Um, and at the same time, maybe today, like the direction that I want to take it is about this sort of multi-faith, multi-spiritual valency. Like it's clear to me that the path you just described comes from somewhere, maybe even from multiple somewheres, like respecting that hierarchy of lineage, working with the headwaters of the healing. And I'm just curious how it all hangs together for you. Like I know that I believe, if memory serves, you grew up in like a nominally Lutheran household, but you've been a spiritual seeker your entire life. You've explored Buddhism, as you said, you've explored West African Orisha traditions and have been initiated in several of those, and you have returned, as we'll get to in a little while, to Islam and to, Sufism, Sufi expressions within Islam. So how do these diverse discoveries of yours through different spiritual lineages inform your focus on ancestor work? And were there other elements too? Like I believe you have a marriage and family therapy background, for instance. So how does
Right.
all of this congeal together? And, a lot of my listeners, readers are either Christian of some form, progressive contemplative Christian, or even post-Christian, but recognizing that that's part of the cosmology that they're reckoning with, even if they're wanting to conscientiously create distance between that. So, how do all these hang together for you in what you're discovering is this potent and effective way to work with the ancestors?
Yeah, it's a big question, of course, but I'll speak into it and see where we end up. I'll say for one that the work I teach publicly, the ancestral lineage healing work, the animism, earth reconnection work, those things aren't sourcing from nor limited by one religion or spiritual system. I didn't learn the lineage repair work from one system. My study of ancestral reverence as it exists within nearly every religion or system on earth has reinforced and refined my understanding of relating with the ancestors, but it's, not that different from relating with, the sun, the trees, the stones, love. You could ask 1,500 people about how they do that and look at how different traditions do that. But at the end of the day, we all are having a direct relationship with those different forces. And that's true with the ancestors. So that relationship with the ancestors, from my perspective, we can choose to experience that relationship consciously or unconsciously, but we can't opt out of it. It's structural. We're not individuals.
Hmm.
And so in some ways, and we'll get into the conversation about religious identity and religious tech and practice, but in some ways, I'm partway through a long detox from modernity, and in particular, extreme individualism, reductive materialism, and the supremacist worldview I was indoctrinated into as an American citizen. And so there's a lot of ways in which those worldviews or those lenses have a religious valence, even though we don't tend to think of them as religious. So in that way, I have, even though I'm not a practicing Christian myself, I would say I have more in common with a Christian from the, 14th century in many ways than I would with someone who's a very materialistic minded Muslim today. There's something about modernity itself that is it can be very isolating and reinforcing of extreme individualism. But that said, I mean, I know it's a bit unusual to be operating within two traditions at once, with Orisha practice and with Islam. My center of gravity is migrated more and more toward Islam in the recent years, but I still honor my relationships with other forces. And the first thing I guess I'd say is that when I'm relating with the ancestors, I'm not worshiping them. It's not Islam as you know, like a lot of monotheistic traditions, I suppose, has a preoccupation with radical non-duality of oneness and of embodying that and of having that be reflected in our style of devotion. And so it means there is an aversion to what's called shirk, or from shin ra kaf. It's like the root in Arabic that is to associate things with Allah, in this case, to obscure or unnecessarily complicate your commitment to non-duality by having multiple directions of prayer, if you will. And for me, that I don't have a concern about that. When I give my wife a hug, or when I'm playing with my kids, or when I feed our cats, I'm not worshiping them. And I might, in a sense, see the oneness or a lot in them, but I'm clear that we're just in relationship. If I give acknowledgement to my ancestors or I allow for them to be a source of guidance, I'm not worshiping them. It's the same with the Orisha. I'm not worshiping them really. I'm respecting them as elder forces in the universe, but they're all manifestations of the divine. And
Mm,
so, in that sense, it's sometimes the emphasis on uh, monotheism or not worshiping other forces can take on this anti-relationship valence. And I think it's really a misunderstanding of the teachings. In Ibn al-Arabi is a Muslim mystic and uh, yeah, from 900 years ago, very prolific teacher in Islam. Um, Captures this through the contrast between the two different words, the tashbih and the tanzih, which is really the transcendence and immanence. And sometimes the way that Islam nowadays it gets interpreted in a reductive way is very heavy toward the transcendence and
mm,
is negating of the way that the one reality expresses through the many forms. And what happens is you make an idol out of God.
mm,
So in that way, like from my perspective, some Muslims are committing shirk in the way they worship Allah,
mm.
which is a radically inflammatory thing to say. But it's a way of saying if you have a really limited, righteous, bullheaded, not mystically oriented understanding of Allah, and you think you got that down, and you're like, this is what it is, this is only what it is, I know better than everybody else. How's that not its own kind of idol worship?
Mm.
You've drained all of the rahmah, all the mercy and compassion and sweetness out of life, and you're not being a very nice person at that point.
Mm. Wow, Daniel, you've offered several really helpful framings here, and I want to kind of slow us down and recapitulate what I think I've heard you say, just so it can really sink in for anybody that for whom this is helpful. You started off responding to my question about how you incorporate multiple traditions in your ancestral healing approach by saying, my words, my summary, that there's like an underlying animacy in the world. And so relating to ancestors is not a fundamentally categorically different thing than relating to trees, to relating to, a brook, relating to the world around us that it reminds me of my friends who, in the philosophy of science, are talking about panpsychism, the idea that all matter, all reality contains, whether inherently or is infused with, some measure of consciousness. Doesn't mean all the measures of consciousness are equal, but that everything has some kind of aliveness that we have flattened in modernity, that we have flattened in this sort of industrializing, colonizing mindset that sees everything as resources to be extracted rather than as beings to relate to. And so
Yeah,
you're starting with that fundamental
th-
assumption of a relational universe.
that's true. And I would just add briefly that a lot of the people that I support or engage with don't identify with one set tradition. I don't think it's necessary to do that per se. Traditions have the advantage when they're working well of bringing discipline and practices,
Hmm.
which really matter.
Hmm.
It's important to have some kind of practice, I think, if you want to cultivate yourself. And traditions also can bring a sense of communal belonging, which is nice, and ancestral kind of connectivity through lineage, through time. But all those things can also become liabilities. They can become a place for our unmetabolized narcissism and arrogance to hang out.
Yes.
And so I feel ambivalent about whether or not people ought to identify with any certain tradition. The main thing is the cultivation of our soul and becoming more loving and wise and able to shoulder more responsibility here.
Hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I've spent, the last quarter century working with folks who in various ways might describe themselves as on some kind of a deconstruction journey, which is facing elements of our inherited faith traditions, in my case, usually evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity, that have frankly been quite unhelpful, that, as you
Sure.
say, can inflame spiritual narcissism, the sense that I or we have like the corner on the truth, and end up inculcating values that are fundamentally opposed to our religious tradition's founders, in this case, Jesus. Like, if I read the
Yeah.
Sermon on the Mount and then look at how the most loud Christians and U.S. American culture are behaving themselves, it's like night and day. So,
Sure.
so I think that you're onto something there, and yet, you like me have found grounding in a particular lineage. We're saying like, yeah, warts and all, like there's enough here that keeps me here, even though I'll put it just speak for myself. I accept full responsibility for how I interpret my tradition and how I practice my tradition, and I'm not going to swallow anything wholesale. And in your case, I love your even framing of monotheism as this radical commitment to non-duality. When that really landed for me, a decade and a half ago, it was like, oh, okay, I can actually see how monotheism is something other than simply a colonizing impulse that migrates over to religion that says everything has to, fit within thus and such a framework. But as you say, our most sublime mystics and teachers and even ethicists see that if we're claiming, kind of like the Shema in Hebrew tradition, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. We could see that as a sectarian rallying cry of my God is better than your God, or we could see it as like that's the end of the sentence. The Lord our God is one, and
Yeah.
that's all inclusive. And how might we relate? And then it gifts us that animacy back, like we get to experience the entire world as alive. But I feel like in Protestantism and in fundamentalism, we ended up having like the minimal viable product religion, that there's a God that's sort of barely active out there, borderline deism. And sometimes when I hear certain expressions of Islam, like maybe Wahhabi influence, it also seems to be this sort of, like you said, such an emphasis on the transcendent, that God is very remote and the rest of the world is disenchanted.
It's true. It's a downer. I mean, when I say I hold Islam as an animist tradition, and I'm an animist, and I'm a Muslim, and those sit well together. That's a less common perspective within the tradition, and it's worth unpackaging a bit what I mean by animism. I'm drawing on people like Graham Harvey, who's a nice person, nice scholar as well, and or lucid scholar, and others in the new animism, which are basically reclaiming the term from a very colonialist, anthropological, arrogant European white dude perspective into a more indigenous solidarity grounded way of saying that basically it's a set of values or an ethic that recognizes that living human beings, we're just one kind of person in a much wider network or field or web of kinship. And those other kinds of people can include like the stones, the spirits of the animals, the elements, the ancestors, the angelic realm, the microorganisms, the other planets, like whatever you can think of, it includes that.
Mhm.
And that those other kinds of people are not less than us, they're just different. And it therefore behooves us to seek to relate in respectful ways with interpersonal relationships between all kinds of people, not only between other humans. So, this ethic of affirming a very broad understanding of personhood or interpersonal relationships, very I thou stance, is it's at the heart of what a lot of indigenous systems on Earth tend to value, which is relationality. And it's something that is also quite present in the 95% of people on Earth who are not indigenous, like me, but nonetheless hold those values. It's present throughout any religious system I've ever encountered to different degrees. And it's an ethic that asks us to find the holy also in everyday life and to be accountable to the sacred in form. And that doesn't mean that we're not also valuing the transcendent aspect of the sacred, but the oneness calls for understanding both
Hmm.
form and formlessness. And so from that place, in Islam, just even in the Quran, in a basic way, there's an affirmation of the reality of the jinn, of the sentience of mountains, of the reality of the dead, of all kinds of things. And there's
Hmm.
stories in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life of the angel Jabril coming to him and talking to him in front of other people, and of him talking to the spirits, and all kinds of things.
Hmm.
And so in that way, I view Islam as at its heart, like Christianity, like Judaism, like there's a comfortable recognition of the that we are embedded in a responsive, animate, living universe, and that the holy doesn't limit itself to just human form. And in Islam, in the last 2 centuries, the rise of the reach of European imperialism and empire, colonialism, combined with petroleum in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, has meant that a well-funded, very fringe element within Islam of the Salafist movement and Wahhabis have come to be seen by a lot of people, sometimes within the tradition, definitely outside the tradition, as normative or like orthodox or correct Islam,
Hmm.
when in fact the more mystical aspects are normative Islam up until the 1800s. So the majority of the history of the tradition is more what people think of when they think of Sufism, and less like uptight Saudi, Taliban, whatever the picture of the
Right.
extremely conservative Muslim is today. That's the exception,
Hmm.
not the norm. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. When 9/11 happened, that was a key watershed moment for me in my own, I call it spiritual composting, others call it deconstruction journey, because it was like precisely when America was sort of blaming Muslims and Islam in this blanket way for these horrific attacks that happened. That was when I really began to learn the idea of blowback for the first time, of like what exactly our own intelligence apparati were doing overseas, for many, many moons, and like asking the question from a non-defensive place of, why do they hate us? And
Mm.
recognizing this very complex interrelationship of the various antagonists involved in this entire chain. And at the very same time, I began to form actual relationships for the first time with living, breathing Muslims, and realized that, I was sold a bill of goods, and in fundamentalist Christianity, that in a lot of ways was projection. And in a lot of ways, it was finding its own mirror image, that what it wanted to see in the Taliban and in other, you know, fundamentalist expressions of itself. And I just started to see that it was this very mimetic dance, but that there was this more ancient and beautiful Islam. And it also drew me into discovering that there's a more ancient and beautiful Christianity. And, that nerdiness of my own desire to study and also to relate, I think saved me from the pain that a lot of my own co-religionists had, where once the form of faith that they grew up in was shown for all of its flaws, they didn't think there was anything else that was valid and available. And so, yeah, it is really
Well,
interesting to see how we might rediscover more vibrant forms if we are drawn to specific traditions that
uh,
can honor this more than human world.
we humans need a lot of correction to not turn out bad. We're like pattern making creatures, and it can really hide in sneaky ways our insecurity in the form of arrogance. Even when I first stepped in with Islam, converted as it were, in my early 20s, I was kind of annoying like that. I wasn't extreme. It was just like a subtle spiritual, or maybe not subtle, I don't know, spiritual arrogance, of just like, hey, that's cool, you're doing that. But I found like the true thing, the good thing. And then I had a rupture with the Sufi community I was connected with because I found out the teacher was doing all the typical spiritual teacher, supervillain things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just, as someone who is openly bi and just generally way left, politically, I'm like, this is a lot of work to maintain this Muslim identity. So I composted it. So, and which is unusual. It's also kind of on my, see how many offensive, jarring things I can say to Muslims in one interview. So I stopped being Muslim for a while, or I was like only very background aligned with the values, but not practicing. And I went and studied, Zen practice, went deeper with Native North American ceremony and circles, eventually got involved in Orisha practice and just kept studying and learning, did a PhD in psychology and all that. And then just in the last couple of years with our move to Spain, being a dad, wanting, it was for a while teaching the girls a little bit of Arabic but there's something about the tradition that I couldn't fully reconcile. It was
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, the Buddhism, the Orisha practice, the paganism, the, native ways, all that somehow plays well with each other. And then there's this other energy of like the Islamic mysticism. And I'm like, I can't, like I couldn't reconcile it really. And so it naturally draws my attention as someone who's knowledge seeking. And I realize the only way I'm going to be able to reconcile that more is by stepping in again. And I needed the discipline. So I started a couple of years ago just doing salat, doing daily prayer. And in a way, like I'm in my late 40s and I care less what people think. I'm just like, well, so my identity isn't tidy and reconciled. Well, too bad, it's just
Mm-hmm.
not. But the practices uh, are sustaining. And
Yeah.
and the challenge for me of integrating in an embodied way the Tawheed, the unitive teachings within Islam, with a deep and a fierce kind of loyalty to the earth and an affirmation of the reality of the unseen. That's been a fruitful challenge. And and it's just meant that I don't have any, I don't need the belonging and the dogma and the identity stuff like I did in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, if I'm in a minority of Muslims who's like backing my trans queer friends, I'll take my chances with the law on that. Like, and so there's a,
Amen.
yeah, so yeah, there's a list of topics in that way, but you get the
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have, I think, the mystical responsibility to navigate our own traditions wisely. And I also know from, just my own psychology as I was composting my faith, there could be ways in which I was really on board with, for lack of a better word, like you said, maybe it's a more in our social context, a progressive or left political stance or social stance of inclusion, or it might be, daring to believe more daring things, minority reports within our tradition. But then I would also have this like nagging inner fundamentalist that would be like, man, you're wrong about this and you're going to hell. Like,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
as someone that, especially in my 20s and 30s who struggled with some anxiety and panic attacks, like I would pay attention to that because that often was like the literal voice of fear that was coming through me. And so my next question, is both a straightforward question and I feel like it often has this sort of pre-rational resonance for a lot of us who are seeking to wisely navigate our spiritual paths and faiths and life in the world. And it is revisiting what you've already named about, speaking to the dead. Like within Christianity, there's a real tension between Protestants, which is how I grew up, and Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and others when it comes to this idea of the veneration of the saints. Like we all have this common scripture in Hebrews 11. It says, the author says, we're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. And so it, affirms that there is some kind of present reality of those who have come before us, in this case being, spiritual lineage. But Protestants and Catholics differ about if it's appropriate to really acknowledge or interact with them. Protestants are kind of like, no, that sounds like necromancy and that sounds bad and wrong. And Catholics are like, get over yourselves. Like we talk to the, the saints just like we, speak to our family members. And
right.
and I feel like within, Islamic Sufism, has its own complex relationship with honoring saints and seeking intercession, practices that some expressions of contemporary Islam view with suspicion, that do see as this kind of shirk, this kind of heresy. But,
Yeah.
Rumi, Hafiz, Ibn Arabi, other Sufi mystics, I feel like, Sufism around the world, Sufi expressions of Islam, there are shrines that you can visit to, these various
Yeah.
forebears. I visited some when I spent time in Turkey a decade ago with our friend Omid Safi and looking at not only, of course, the shrine of Rumi, but even of Shams. And so, how does this all cohere? If you could reiterate that. Like for you, is
Yeah.
this sort of
Sure.
Sufi approach a doorway that allows your ancestral
I,
work and Islamic
I,
practice to coexist?
I don't even know, like, I feel ambivalence for what it's worth about Sufism as an identification. I was definitely
Hmm.
identified that way 20 years ago when I was practicing in that
Hmm.
moment. But now, like, I'm not associated with certain tariqah. They're interesting. If there was like a Sufi order in my neighborhood, I'd be like, what are you up to? Like, what's the vibe? Is it family friendly? When are you open? What are you doing? But my main Sufi teacher, I guess, in that way is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He's like the original Sufi, if you will.
Hmm.
And so I don't know that there's and it feels like an extra layer in a way, or I don't know that there's a need necessarily to add that
Hmm.
qualifier. For
Hmm.
me, the tradition itself is mystical. And so, and if I happen to find a nice Sufi community that doesn't seem like it's gone off the deep end with the power dynamics and it's kind and loving, sure, I'd be happy to be a part of it potentially if I have the time to do all the extra practices. With
Hmm.
two young kids, it's like, oh, I'm going to do another 30 minutes of prayer today. I'm like, I'm not sure where I'm going to fit it in. So it's also just the limitations on my time for devotion. But that said, about the ancestors, there are different factors. One we spoke to is like, is it worship? No. Some people could take it in that direction. If someone receives a healing from the ancestors, like, okay, so the mercy of Allah pours through the wisdom of the dead. I had the mercy of Allah pour through some antibiotics recently for strep
Hmm.
throat, and I was so glad to take them.
Hmm.
It was miserable before that. And that doesn't mean I worship the pharmacist. It means I'm experiencing a blessing through that particular form. So I don't have it basically it comes from this idea that all of the unseen is somehow this like divine status. It's just the unseen. It doesn't mean you can be in relationship. You can bring your relationship that's intrinsic with the ancestors even more conscious. And that doesn't mean you're engaging in worship. You're just recognizing that we're in a relational web that isn't entirely visible to us.
Hmm.
So no problem there. I actually see it as bad etiquette or a lack of adab to deny the reality of the dead when the Quran itself actively affirms the dead. ولا تقولوا لما يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن ولا تشعرون. It's like don't deny that those who have died continue to exist just because you don't see them.
Hmm.
God knows. No. So that's one thing. The next is like, is it wise just because they exist? Is it prudent? That's a much more practical question.
Yeah, let's
Or are
go
you
there.
going to, yeah, are you going to get all tangled up in some crazy stuff and get energetically zapped and
Hmm.
unleash a portal to doom in your home? Um,
Right. Or,
and
or, or
it's
yeah, or even on a more basic level, like you were saying about whether or not you'd get involved with like a local Sufi community. Like, I have kids, I have a busy life. Like, does starting engaging in ancestor work, is that going to be like a whole other complicated and time-consuming set of
right.
practices, you
Sure,
know?
sure. Well, there's that. Yeah. But to speak to the safety thing, no, it's not inherently safe. I actually differ from most of my psychologically oriented colleagues who I view as being reckless in this regard
Mm.
by relating with the ancestors in a primarily psychological way. I'm very like old school, don't mess with that stuff
Hmm.
unless there's a need to, unless you need to heal something up
Mm.
because it's impacting you.
Mm.
I think it's dangerous to relate with the dead, but I also think it's dangerous to avoid them. It's much like the living. The living are dangerous. but we depend on one another, and it's dangerous to avoid all living people too. And
True.
so, in that way, the intent of the ancestral lineage healing work is to make sure that you, your children, your family, your descendants, your loved ones are not being adversely impacted by unmetabolized pain, trauma, deaths from your ancestors. So the resolving of ancestral debts is something I believe that's present even in the Bible. And it is something that is very cross-cultural, and it does not require any worship, and it can be done safely in a way that ideally, if you're doing it right, brings you as a participant in those types of repair practices into a sense of deeper communion with your faith, with your deeper clarity about your own destiny and your particular service and contribution in the world,
Mhm.
and more resilience and support to carry that out.
Mhm.
The one of the focusing questions is, are there any practices that the living can do to assist in the journey of the soul after death? And I think I know the least in some ways about Protestant Christianity because I grew up in a way surrounded by it, so then it lessened my motivation to focus on it. But I believe the answer even there is yes. Like that prayers and like acts of service, and that it's possible to wish well for those who have died. May they be well. And that those prayers matter, and that it's not seen as some kind of necromantic transgression to wish well for the dead.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I agree. I think that it is important to not drop our relational care for our loved ones just because they're no longer incarnate. The soul, the spirit continues. We have influence on them. They have influence on us. And so in that way, the lineage repair work is just about a continuation of an ethic of community care beyond the death of the body. And there's also an implication in there of engaging in cultural healing and repair and making sure that the debts we've inherited are debts that we participate in cleaning up. That's
Mhm.
just looking after the holy by tending to the kingdom here, if you will, by tending to the condition of life on earth. And so in that way, mm, what I see ancestral healing practices as a way of um, expanding the reach of our love through community, through care for the unseen as well, and recognition that the soul does continue beyond the death of the body.
Hmm. Yeah, as usual, you said a lot there, and I'm considering, yeah, that idea of yes, we have this posture of reverence toward ancestors, but that our ancestors weren't perfect, and that part of that healing and that repair is also reckoning with the damaging aspects of their legacies. For you and I, as less melanated people, that includes our settler colonial histories and backgrounds. And how does one even approach such a vast topic? Like how much of it, I'm thinking of my anthropological classes I took in undergrad, like how much of that is us imposing our modern values upon our ancestors in what lens we bring to the possibility of healing? Are we simply trying to make them good, uh, you know, awake 21st century American
Sure.
expats? Like how do
Right.
we handle that?
Yeah, there's a few things to keep in mind. For one, the when most people around the world who would engage with the ancestors, I don't even know if it should be called ancestor reverence. Reverence in the sense of like respect, I guess, but not
Hmm.
worship.
Hmm.
So when we just engage with the ancestors, for most people, that we're engaging with them in the present now. They're not who they were only any more than I'm who I was when I was 8 years old. Yes, there's an echo of truth in that, but not only that. And so who they are now is different than who they were 50, 100, 500 years ago. So they continue to change, for one. Uh, Another principle is that all of us, every single person on earth, has in our lineages people who enacted what we could think of as like victim, victimizer dynamics. Like the full spectrum of humanity is present in our ancestry. Now, that doesn't mean everyone has the same social position or that everyone has ancestrally experienced the same amount of harm in recent time. That's certainly not true. I come from lineages that have enacted relatively more harm than someone whose ancestors were enslaved or who experienced the other genocide, the one toward indigenous peoples in the founding of the United States, or. So not everyone's lineages have experienced the same amount of harm in recent time. Not everyone is positioned culturally, societally to experience the same amount of harm. As an American white dude, I experience much less harm than most other identities on Earth because of where I'm positioned. But all of us have the full spectrum of humanity within us.
Mm.
And all of us in that way are down lineage from the enactment of real violence toward others. And we have also experienced harm, whether or not that is in knowable recent time. So it's important to start from that baseline so that we're not diminishing the full humanity of anybody.
Yeah.
That said, if we want to claim our ancestral blessings and to say, there's goodness in my people, and there's beauty, there are spiritual gifts, there are practical gifts. I feel good about who I am. I affirm this body as a one locus of manifestation for the sacred. And then you kind of need to sign up for all of it. Be like, okay, I just signed up for the ancestral blessings. In the fine print on that are all the unpaid debts and burdens as well.
Mm.
And that's such good news. I see a lot of people who want to run from that, who want to be like, well, I'm down lineage from settler colonialists, but I'm not one myself. Or I didn't do that personally.
Yeah.
Or I really want to be good. I want to be purified. I want to repent. I want to be cleansed from this kind of, taint of cultural harm. I don't want to be the bad guy.
Mm.
It makes me think in a way of the teachings around original sin or whatever. It's one of the things around Christianity. I'm like, I don't get that part, or that's like
Mm.
that's it's
Yeah.
unusual to me. But nonetheless, I can imagine if I try to see the positive side of it, there's a kind of discipline of not opting out of the so-called shadow or what is heavy and undesirable about the human experience. And in that way, I'm a fan of that teaching
Hmm.
because I'm a big proponent of saying, embrace the debts of our people, acknowledge the ways your people have caused harm to others, because that gives you leverage from which to participate in useful cultural repair in the present.
Mm.
And cultural repair is a form of love. It's a form of humility and stitching the world together and bringing the sacred to earth by saying, I, on behalf of my people, am sorry for what happened. And I commit to moving in different ways now and being part of tangible repair for what's happened. We can't do it like that. We're going to do it in a better way, in another way. I'm sorry for it. We did that. We're going to do it different now.
Mm. Yeah, that sense of we is often missing from our culture, I think. And what you're describing reminds me of some colleagues of mine, Ched Myers and Elaine Enns, and they have a beautiful book and paradigm called Healing Haunted Histories that strikes many of the same notes, where they help people, especially with settler colonialist backgrounds, to digest and metabolize our past by looking at our bloodlines, our landlines, but then also our song lines. And I think that our
Mhm.
song lines correspond with what you're describing as the ancestral blessing, but we need to honestly look at, our landlines. Where have we migrated? Our bloodlines, who have we been, in order to appreciate the complexity of the song line, the complexity of the blessing that is available to us.
Yeah. Yeah. Identity is It's a work in progress. It's a mess. This question of belonging, of identity, it's one that's especially turbulent for people of settler colonialist ancestries, which I imagine a fair amount of your listeners are.
Hmm.
And in centering that, just because that's my experience and presumably your experience to a large degree, I don't want that to overshadow the different histories of people who've always been in the Americas, for example, or who experienced enslavement ancestrally. And so, it's nuanced, but for people who are arrived in a place typically through harm and non-consensual occupation of others' lands, that messes with your sense of belonging. It's a kind of ancestral curse that you enact upon yourself until it's faced, until there's been a reckoning. And that reckoning, at least, in the United States, knowing we're both US citizens, that reckoning is not yet happened,
Hmm.
let's say.
Hmm.
And so, um, yeah, the ancestors can provide a container for those kinds of healings to take place because we need a bigger container ritually to face heavy truths and to face bigger kinds of pain.
Yeah.
And belonging, it doesn't mean you don't get to opt out of all that. Like there's a need to participate in the long term in the healing and correction, knowing the work won't be finished in our lifetime.
Hmm. Let's talk for a moment about the space that we find ourselves in. I feel like we're in this unprecedented convergence of crises, not just one, but we have, this political polarization that's reaching a fever pitch. We have 122 million people displaced globally. Climate anxiety manifesting as this new form of grief that so many people are feeling now on an existential level. And yes, there are reparations movements demanding that we reckon with this intergenerational trauma. So your work emphasizes that healing our ancestral lines isn't just personal, but it is collective work. How does ancestral work specifically address the kinds of upheaval that we're experiencing in recent years? Like, what would you say to someone who's wondering whether connecting with their dead relatives has any bearing on Gaza or Ukraine or Sudan or climate collapse or the political chaos that's happening in the United States right now?
Yeah. For one, any kind of spiritual practice, whatever it might be, whether it's ancestral healing work, devotional prayer, doing a Zen retreat, whatever, none of it is a substitute for engaging in tangible systemic change work to shift the harmful systems and the radical unequal distribution of wealth and the tremendous ongoing militaristic imperialist colonialism that's fueling the genocide in Palestine and Sudan, et cetera. So we could detail all the like really systemic harms around race and gender and just capitalism. The spiritual practice doesn't give you a pass around finding a way that is available to you that's hopefully at least somewhat congruent with your sense of self and identity, knowing that there's not only one way to participate. But I do have the view that we have a kind of moral obligation to find any tangible ways that are available to us to try to participate in those necessary changes, period. And that cuts across faith and identity lines. That said, it those systemic harms also have an internal reverberation in reality. And our individual life and experience, our psyche, our thoughts, our soul, our emotions, all that is are not totally separable from these systems as well. So we don't want to only do systemic change work and be like, well, my existence doesn't matter.
Mm.
I can show up in any kind of way at all as long as I'm doing activism in an outer sense. Well, that there's a disconnect. We need also to have our inner life and to see that it really is one whole. We want this non-dual ethic, our inner world, the world around us. There's no separation fundamentally. So both matter, both have a place. In that sense, cleaning up our ancestral lineages and cleaning up the field of energy around us that isn't only us, but that's the things we're connected to, that does matter also. It matters in a few ways. For one, it matters directly for the dead who are suffering, and it helps them to be more at peace. That is good unto itself,
Hmm.
period. Second, it tends to lead to more healthy families when we're not passing down generationally unmetabolized ghost energy and trauma and interference and death pollution and all kinds of heavy things. When we clean that up from our lineages, that leads to healthier kids and a more liberated generation that comes after us. So it's helpful systemically on the family level of scale. It's also helpful to get clear about what our particular specific role is in the larger uh, holy catastrophe of the times, if you will.
Hmm.
Because there's a lot of beauty on earth right now, and there's a lot of injustice and pain. And it's easy to become overwhelmed by that, understandably. And one focusing question is like, Ya Allah, or Dear God, or Dear Earth, Dear Sacred Powers, what's my specific role? What are my specific gifts? What's my specific medicine? What are my sacred instructions? What am I here to do? What's my destiny? Ask the question however you need to, but it's like, what's my Dharma seat? Like, make me an instrument of your love, but how does that look? So that's actually a really relevant question. That's a place where spiritual practice meets activism.
Hmm.
And in general, if you are doing you, because I feel like we have a moral, ethical obligation to be ourselves. So if you're doing you in the deep holistic sense, you're typically also going to be enacting the thing that's most usefully of service on earth. And in that sense, it will require typically some introspection and maybe even some healing up with your lineages to be able to do that. Because it's one thing to have insight into who you are and to have even a bit of a sense of your calling. It's another thing to be able to do it.
Hmm.
The gap between vision and effective action sometimes is great.
It's true.
And one of the things we need to do there is tend to relationships. What are the relationships that need to be healed for me to actually enact the vision I've been given? One of the things that might need to happen is to clear up some ancestral trauma and pain. So you live in 30 years longer than you would have otherwise. And you actually get to write that fourth and fifth book
Hmm.
so that you don't have to grindingly, unconsciously repeat the unmetabolized pain of your lineages. In that way, I don't focus a lot on my ancestors personally. Not
Hmm.
now. I
Hmm.
did before.
Hmm.
I don't think it has to be a big focus necessarily. For a lot of people, it's a focus for a cycle of time. But bringing those dynamics conscious, getting clear what your gifts are, healing up the obstructions, that makes a big difference in effectively carrying out what we're here to do. And that's what we want. We want when we die to be, and like the life review is like, well, how'd it go? You don't want to be like, well, I got distracted a bit, but it was all right. You want to actually be able to be like, I dug in. I took some time, even in my 30s, and dug in. And by the time I was in my 50s, I was even humble about it and able to be useful
Hmm.
or whatever, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a valuable perspective. It kind of reminds me in a parallel in magical studies, this contemporary occultist Jason Miller talks about how we not only work with spirits, but we are spirits. We happen to be incarnate. And what you're talking about is like we're not only working with our ancestors and healing those lineages, but we are in the process of becoming ancestors ourselves.
For
Uh,
sure.
and like the UN in like last fall, September 2024, had this declaration on future generations that they adopted at this thing they called the Summit of the Future, where they resolved to become good ancestors, ensuring that current generations consider the needs and interests of future generations enacted through the practicalities of the policies and the programs that they were considering. And so I love what you just said because your work is inviting us to embody our role as ancestors for future generations. Um, and again, we're watching, not to belabor the point, but we're watching climate collapse unfold in real time. We're watching this real ecological debt that future generations will inherit. So I feel like you've already answered this to some degree, but how does working with our ancestors help us to become good ancestors ourselves? Thinking like 7 generations ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that keeps me engaged in the lineage healing focus after over 20 years of helping others with that and doing my own tending is the way that it is an off ramp from extreme individualism, and it helps people to come back into a more diffuse relational interdependent sense of self, which I feel is the way that we tended to move from pre-modernity all around the world. And then many folks, not all, got a bit enraptured in a more isolated, individual, materialistic sense of what we are. And it's possible to come back from that. And so the first thing is to move from a place of interdependence and to recognize that what's happening to me and what's happening to you are not fundamentally separable.
Hmm.
And you can't genocide a people and think that that doesn't hurt you also. You can't just take from the earth without respect and reciprocity and think that doesn't hurt you also. But to feel that, to let it impact, there's a need to move out of a deeply individualistic, isolated understanding of what you are. And in that way, I I see that the ancestral work has that effect on people. So that's nice. That
Hmm.
encourages me to
Hmm.
continue with it. And yeah, how else does it help? Well,
Hmm.
we're going to be dead soon, all of us, everyone listening. And hopefully not today, but it's your
Right.
day. Hopefully not.
Yeah.
And good luck if it is. And it's good to um, hold that long-term vision by knowing that we're moving in a way that isn't just about our lifetime. And that can include in a mystical orientation, recognizing that there can be a kind of death before death. We'll call it the fana in Arabic and or the annihilation of the self in God. But by whatever name, different traditions, the same is talked about in different ways in Christian mysticism, I'm sure. Um, that it's not like you stop existing exactly,
Mhm.
but the subsisting, the baqa in Arabic, the what's left, is moving from a much more ecological, interdependent stance. It's like the voice of the land and the cloud of witnesses and the lineage of awakened saints all at once.
Mhm.
When, sometimes people might just be in their personality. That's fine too. And they're just like hungry and need to rest or whatever. But when someone's really out of the way, um, there's a vastness that can move through this human form. And work with the ancestors is one way to prepare the ground for those types of states to come through more easily.
Hmm.
Because we're recognizing in a way that we're already dead.
Mhm. Yes. Wow. I love that. It feels like what you're describing, proposing is almost like a reorientation of our internal GPS. Like how do I position myself and experience myself in the world? And, in my own work, reading not only, classics of spirituality and masters of spirituality, but anthropology and kind of our history as a species, it does seem like we have experienced, whether it's, a literal, fall in Eden, or it's more of this writ large, we have this plunge into this alienation from spirit, self, other, and world. And that so many of our ancestors, while not perfect, had a felt sense of connection to spirit, other, and world. And it's almost like our definition of the self in modernity has edged all of those other elements out so that we can commit a genocide and delude ourselves into thinking that that's not going to impact us somehow. I often say that the pro-social lifeways of so many indigenous cultures wasn't because they had an elevated ethic per se, but they would no sooner hurt members of their community than we would cut off our own finger. Like it would just be too painful in a felt and visceral sense for me to, cut off my nose to spite my face. But that is how we now behave as a culture. We have this fourfold alienation. And so I hear what you're saying as one vital path, and I think it's beautiful that you emphasize this could be a seasonal thing of intense focus, and then afterwards it just recedes into the background of a life well lived. But nonetheless, it is part of this, what, Joanna Macy might have called the work that reconnects.
Yeah. I don't know why I'm thinking about this right now, but I used to be a bit more of the spiritual but not religious type in a
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
But as I've gotten older, and maybe it's always there, I really appreciate the limitations and guardrails of just straightforward ethics
Hmm.
and what to do and what not to do. I know I don't always agree with where those settings are.
Right.
Sometimes I feel like they're like morally too uptight or too in the gender binary or too, like whatever. But actually having structure and ethics where it's like, don't be a liar. Don't be like a treacherous, bad neighbor. Like, look out for people, help people out. These kind of like the fundamental uh, basis of good character are the way to prepare to be a good ancestor. They're the most important way to prepare for the post-death journey. I don't think it matters that much what identity you declare. It's not like a team sport. I think
Hmm.
it matters like, are you being a good person in a fundamental way? And if you are, you're going to navigate the next reality just fine. And if not, you're going to have a confusing, hard time of it. There are consequences for our actions on a soul level. And so the point there is really just to, I was thinking recently, what am I grateful for? One of the things I'm grateful for is just like all the people making ethical choices on the daily and not even getting noticed for it, but just having the kind of discipline and the constraints around good character.
Hmm.
It's what holds the world together. It's more important than any religious identification. And it is a message again and again from our ancestors, as I experience them at least, that having constraints on how much we take from the earth, having respect for others' land, having proactive affirmation of ancestral diversity and beauty and difference, uh, sharing what we have rather than hoarding, like all that is a way of saying like, don't be an exploitative, racist, colonialist, sexist capitalist. If we could frame it in like
Yeah.
2025,
Right.
leftist jargon, but
Hmm.
it's really just about good character. Same.
Yeah, it
And
is.
that's the foundation of the path, period.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And yeah, and what I said a moment ago, I wasn't meaning to diss ethics as a formal means of transmission, only noting that I do think that the ethics have flowed out of this felt sense of connection, but it works in the other direction as well. I think you're right. Like we teach our children right from wrong before they have a cosmic felt sense of it, and hopefully they grow into that. And also, hopefully, they push back against the formal ethics they were taught that end up not resonating. They begin to have a voice of discernment, like you're describing about the specific settings that we might have in
Yeah.
any particular culture that deserve to be pushed back against. But I
To your
agree, it is
earlier
some both
question
and.
about the our internal fundamentalists that would haunt us,
Hmm.
I think it's important as we mature in our path to know how to engage with that voice.
Mm-hmm.
and to stand up to that one and be like, I'll pray for you, but I think you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're wrong about this. I think your judgments are not in alignment with the underlying teachings. And I'm going to take a stand about that. And so that might be scary to stand up to those voices internally and externally, but it's the moment. There's so much at stake right now on the earth. I see, yeah, speaking just within U.S. Protestant Christian context, it's been good to see some of the confronting of Christian Zionism, which has been an enabling force in a major way for the US led genocide in Palestine that continues to today
Mm-hmm.
and the occupation. And so
Absolutely.
there's so much good work to be done within communities of faith to say, hey, something has gotten off track here.
Yeah.
And the ancestors themselves can be allies in that because they're like, yes, it did get off track. That has roots back to the 1400s or whatever it is. But before that, we weren't picking that up.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a time of a lot of reckoning right now. And that's not something to undertake alone. And we each are down lineage from sources of wisdom and love and specific good medicine.
I agree. Well, Daniel, how can someone deepen their ancestral lineage work with you? Like walk us through that. If we've been listening and we're like, wow, this feels really compelling. This feels maybe even like a missing piece for my own personal peace and well-being, but also how I can start to become a good ancestor for future generations. Like walk us through what engagement with specifically your organization, Ancestral Medicine, could look like.
Yeah. Yeah. Our organization is especially focused on the reintroduction of animist ethics or earth honoring ethics within any tradition or not in traditions as well. And so uh, we do have we have a lot of courses toward that effect through the website, but with the specialization in ancestral reconnection, the main forms of engaging that are with the online course, Ancestral Lineage Healing, which we offer a few times a year, work with a practitioner. And as I mentioned, there are practitioners who can work online and guide people through things, including in a low income way if needed. And that work's available in over 30 languages now. And that directory is on the website. It's also, the book is translated in over 10 languages, and that's available also as an audio book. We do have in-person intensives and events. I was teaching this last year in Belfast and Costa Rica and Sarajevo. And so we have in-person events that happen with me and with others who are trained to guide those offerings. And then there's free teachings and talks on the site as well, which are also translated. So lots of ways to engage and like more cautious and more diving in. But the point of all of those offerings is to help people who would participate them to access your own sources of guidance directly and to do that in a way that's good for you, your family, and your cultural leveling up.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're listening, I actually want to extend an offer for this ancestral lineage healing course, which, as you said, is like one of your foundational courses. We're actually going to offer 30% off on this course if you do feel called to enroll and to check it out before Christmas. And the code will be in the show notes, but it's Optimistic 15 will be in the code in the notes there. And also you can download a few free chapters of the book, Ancestral Medicine, that has a lot of the fundamental and core ideas. So all of that will be in a link below. But
Great.
yeah,
And
Daniel,
and
thanks so much.
I would just mention as a very final thing, if there are some of your listeners who are drawn to the work, but also like feel religiously cautious, I guess, that there are uh, folks of Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, different orientations within Christianity who are practitioners as well. So just to know that that's also an option to find folks of a similar faith background. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a wonderful community from everything I've seen. Of course, I live in Asheville where you used to teach in person, so I know a number of practitioners who have been really enriched by your work. So thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us today and engaging this really stimulating conversation.
thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for your good work.